I am on chapter 9 of The Haunted Self, which is kind of the Bible of structural dissociation theory. I am so geeked about this chapter. It put so many things into place for me. I'm going to read a whole lot of it. I'm sure this will end up being multiple parts, but basically it uses Pierre Janet's hierarchy of action tendencies and draws correlations with that and structural dissociation. And so it's kind of like the action tendencies hierarchy range from extremely basic survival instincts to some relational skills, and then to the ability to be really present and to be really mindful. And so it's just kind of this range from really, really basic functioning to really, really healthy, really integrated, really embodied functioning. And basically what happens with structural dissociation is when our personality kind of fractures because of trauma, parts of us kind of can be on different rungs of this hierarchy ladder. And so when we have an emotional flashback and it feels like we revert to a younger or less mature version of ourselves, it's because that part kind of is stuck at a lower level of functioning. Okay, anyway, I'll get to reading. I'm sure it'll be multiple parts. Action tendencies involve adaptations to environmental challenges. That is, they have developed out of a long history of evolutionary selection and are goal-directed. These actions foremost involve perceptions, including perceptions of physical sensations and emotional feelings, thoughts, decisions, and movements. When we perceive the right kind of internal and external stimuli and are in the right psychobiological state, we awaken a matching action tendency from latency and enter a stage of readiness. For example, when our blood sugar is low and we notice the accompanying sensation of hunger, we become ready to start looking for food. When we perceive a threat cue and feel scared, we are ready to defend ourselves. When we are alone but highly dependent on others, we are ready to cry out for help or support. If we actually initiate one or more specific actions, and if so, how soon, often depends on the appearance and our perception of one or more additional stimuli that operate as go signals. The initiation of an action is followed by a stage of execution, which involves carrying out the action, such as chewing and swallowing food after taking it in hand. The final stage of action tendencies is their completion. For example, Laura noticed and realized that she should not eat too much chocolate because her stomach was not used to it. This perception and realization constituted a stop signal for eating chocolate. Completion often involves conscious realization. In the case of automatic actions, completion involves rather unconscious awareness of what we have done and that we have achieved the goal of the action tendency or cannot achieve it. But important actions and their results must usually be realized consciously. Action tendencies require a combination of mental energy, physical energy, and they involve movement and the capacity to use these energies, mental efficiency. The more complex an action tendency is, the higher our mental energy and mental efficiency must be to initiate, execute, and complete it. Mental actions allow us to weigh the merits of alternative mental or behavioral actions, such as contemplating different therapeutic avenues to address the patient's presenting problem. In this sense, we can save time and energy. Perhaps even more importantly, by anticipating the effects of our actions, we are able to select gainful actions and prevent harmful ones. For example, a therapist prevents trouble when he or she accurately foresees how a particular critical remark will affect a patient with features of BPD. Anticipating effects of actions involves presentification and is the basis of human culture. However, mental actions can only affect the environment indirectly. For example, it is often far easier to plan certain behaviors, to make a promise to engage in behavioral actions, than to actually engage in them. Survivors may firmly promise, "I will get up early tomorrow and do my homework," or "I will leave my abusive partner and live alone." Nevertheless, when it comes down to it, some survivors may be unable to carry these promises from the stage of readiness to the stage of initiation and beyond to completion. They stop before they have started, or they feebly and unenthusiastically initiate housework or try to be present or tolerate their feelings, but may soon give up. Action tendencies not only require energy and efficiency, but also regulation. One regulator of action tendencies is effort, because each action needs a particular adaptive degree of force or dedication. When we try too hard or do not try hard enough to do something, our actions are likely to fail. It takes experience to know how much effort an adaptive action needs. Experience improves mental efficiency because it saves useless expenditure of energy and raises the probability of success. According to Janet, as a regulator of action and action tendencies, effort is a secondary action that accompanies movement, which is the primary action. Another action regulator is success, which Janet called the action of triumph. Levels and complexity of action tendencies. The hierarchy suggests that we can consider our personality to be a construction that involves different levels of action tendencies. In this sense, personality is a complex dynamic system with higher level tendencies that have emerged from but cannot be fully explained by lower level action tendencies. So each level of the hierarchy operates on its own set of principles. For example, tendencies that involve language, hence symbolization, are of a higher level than pre-symbolic action tendencies and cannot be explained by these lower level action tendencies. Language has its own principles. Action systems range from basic reflexes that are largely automatic and rigid to highly reflective, voluntary, and creative actions. Janet conveniently divided them into 3 groups: lower, intermediate, and higher action tendencies. Each group includes several sublevels, so there's 9 total sublevels. The levels of action tendencies that constitute personality evolve with age and experience. This layer is adaptive because sometimes we need lower action tendencies, such as reflective movements to attain our goal, such as when riding a bicycle or typing, and at other times intermediate or higher action tendencies are needed. Thus, higher action tendencies are not better or more adaptive in themselves than lower ones. It depends on the situation. It is not adaptive to think too much about riding a bicycle, for instance. Lower level action tendencies are more efficient for these kinds of actions. Lower action tendencies. Lower action tendencies are the most simple. Many of them involve automatic and primary behaviors that we as humans have in common with other mammals. They primarily involve limited and nonverbal actions that serve very short-term goals. With the exception of disorganized movements, they require at least some degree of synthesis. Degrees of personification and presentification only emerge with basic symbolic action tendencies, which require simple language and more thought and planning. Disorganized movement. In the absence of mental efficiency, mental energy is not used for any action tendency. A complete lack of mental efficiency results in disorganized movement rather than an effort to achieve a goal through purposeful action. For example, epileptic patients expend energy in undirected agitations when they have a seizure. Patients with an anxiety disorder when they panic, and trauma survivors when they experience vehement trauma-related emotion. So the full hierarchy is this. The lower level action tendencies include basic reflexes, pre-symbolic regulatory action tendencies, pre-symbolic social personal action tendencies, basic symbolic action tendencies. Intermediate action tendencies include reflexive symbolic action tendencies and reflexive action tendencies. Higher level action tendencies include prolonged reflective action tendencies, experimental action tendencies, and progressive action tendencies. So there's lower, intermediate, and higher level, but within those levels, there are 4 subcategories in lower level, just 2 sublevels in intermediate, and 3 sublevels in higher level action tendencies. The rest of this chapter takes them in order, starting with the most basic. So this is level 1. Basic reflexes. A basic reflex involves an adaptive, automatic, involuntary, and organized reaction to an attractive or aversive stimulus. At this level, we essentially synthesize one stimulus and one response that has proved advantageous from an evolutionary standpoint. For example, we automatically jerk our hand away from a hot stove or reach out to catch ourselves when we start to fall. In Pavlov's terms, we respond to an unconditioned stimulus with an unconditioned reflex. This reflex can be a physiological response, such as sweating when we are afraid, or a motor reaction, such as a startle reflex. Unconditioned stimuli may be positive or attractive, such as food, shelter, warmth, and gentle touch, or they may be negative. For example, emotional abuse and neglect and physical and sexual abuse include major aversive unconditioned stimuli, such as pain and abandonment. These stimuli unleash defensive reflexes time and time again in the survivor. Typically, reflexes operate on a primitive on and off basis. That is, an unconditioned stimulus makes us either explode in action or it doesn't. For example, we either startle with full power or we don't startle at all. This crude regulation of action can be adaptive because we will instantly spend major energy only on reactions that are essential to our survival. When we engage in these reflexes, we inhibit action tendencies that are irrelevant to the task at hand and that would interfere with the execution of the reflex. For example, when our hand touches a hot stove, we do not continue to tend to the food that we are cooking or to talk to the friend we were speaking with. The downside of this primitive on and off regulation is that we cannot modulate or time the reflex. For example, if a survivor were better able to synthesize his or her defense system and exploration system, that person could initiate defensive actions at the best possible moment rather than only at the moment when the unconditioned stimulus appeared. Thus, the survivor would not cringe automatically when a therapist raised his hand while talking, but would wait to see what happened next before immediately reacting. There are many shades of gray between the levels of the hierarchy. For example, a survivor may say, "I am a little jumpy." He or she feels apprehensive and is ready to startle, but does not engage in this reflex yet. So there is a double action, the inclination to startle as well as the inclination to inhibit this reflex. Inhibition of reflexes involves regulatory action that appears at the next level of the hierarchy. In addition to a single exteroceptive stimulus and a single response, perception motor action cycles include a perception of our bodily condition. For example, our degree of attention and response to food depends on how hungry or satiated we are. Because action systems are homeostatic and homeostasis essentially involves the body, we perceive our bodily condition in relation to most simple action tendencies here onward. Awareness of our bodily condition is most important in that it allows us to select and engage in potentially adaptive reactions, and then move on to the next action. Hence, the actual condition of our body influences how strongly we will be focused on a particular unconditioned stimulus, and how strongly we will respond. For example, survivors often feel fear. The related physical sensations of fear function as the equivalent of sensations of hunger. The more hungry we are, the more strongly we are compelled to seek food, and the more fearful we are, the more we are compelled to seek safety and avoid danger. But survivors are often fearful regardless of whether they are actually safe or not. They respond to the sensations of fear with continued engagement of their defense action system and a narrowed focus on potential threat cues, which ultimately does not create homeostasis, but rather a serious imbalance. Not all action is completely automatic at the level of basic reflexes. We can still learn, create new syntheses at this level. For example, we can learn to associate a particular stimulus, such as a certain sound, with an unconditioned stimulus, like a blow to the head, which changes our original response to the stimulus. An example, a survivor learned as a child to immediately engage in defensive reflex when he or she heard footsteps coming from behind because this usually preceded being hit. Unfortunately, such reflexes persist long after there is a need for them. A survivor who is now safe will still sometimes regress to this level of reflexes and startle or cringe when he or she heard footsteps coming from behind. This regression implies a major decrease of mental efficiency, which interferes with his or her ability to regulate the defensive reflex. Often, an emotional part of the personality, meaning an EP, will react with reflex to a stimulus, which cannot be stopped or modulated by the survivor as an apparently normal part of the personality or by a therapist. This EP has retracted the field of consciousness to only a threat cue and an immediate reflexive response, and little more. I'm going to stop here for now, but this is just rung 1 out of 9 rungs of the hierarchy, and I'll be going over all of them in future videos.